Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final edition of In the Boardroom with attorney Andy Phillips and Attolles Law for 2025. But no worries, we have been renewed for a third season, so you will see the series back in 2026. I'm Sarah Deidre Kasdorf with the Wisconsin Counties Association. I have the pleasure of getting to welcome all of you to today's webinar and also go over just a few logistics before we get started. So first thing I will mention is this webinar today is being recorded. The recording, along with the PowerPoint slides, will be available on the WCA website. Typically, we have it up by the end of the day today. If not, it will likely be up by the end of the day tomorrow. If for those of you that have questions during the webinar, we will use both the chat and the Q&A feature of Zoom. So for most of you on the bottom of your screen, you will see an icon that says chat and another that says Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to click on either the chat or the Q&A buttons. We will be monitoring the chat and Q&A throughout this webinar. With that, we have a number of speakers that are joining us today. I am going to turn it over to Andy Phillips, who will provide a welcome on behalf of Attolles Law, as well as introduce our presenters for this afternoon. So, Andy?
Thank you, Sarah. Who made the decision to renew? Who made that decision?
You know, Andy, there's a lot of higher ups and a large process that we had to go through to get you renewed for a third season.
Well, I know I got to send. Who do I send the holiday gift to? That's what I got to know. So we'll figure that out
We
eventually.
will figure that out. The list is long.
I'm sure it is. So happy holidays, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Really important topic today, and it's a follow-up discussion from a conversation we started in October, which was focused on intergovernmental agreements, but also touched on the importance of those agreements in the context of Act 12 innovation grants. And so, given the feedback that we got from that, as well as several conversations that we've had over the past couple of years about implementation of Act 12 and the Innovation Grant Program, we thought it'd be a good idea to revisit this here at year end because we do have a time period approaching where people are going to start applying for innovation grants. So I'm going to introduce Thomas first. Thomas Cameron is an attorney. He's a colleague of mine here at Attolles. Joins us from a big firm in Milwaukee that shall go unnamed for now. Eventually, you can figure that out. And he has a background both in public finance and local government. And so this topic is near and dear to Thomas's heart. But I want to introduce what I think is the featured speaker today. That's Valia Foy. And Valia is the Division Administrator for State and Local Government Finance. Did I get that right, Valia?
You
Close?
did. State and local finance. Yep.
There you go. State and local finance. I had a government there. I wanted to make your business card even more scrunched. So Valia is with the Department of Revenue, and I will tell you that working with Valia and her team, if you've not done so already, is an absolute joy. Whenever I have questions about how does something work, I'll call up Valia, and if she can't answer the question, she's going to get me to somebody who can. And so Valia brings a world of expertise in dealing with innovation grants in Act 12 that we simply don't have because revenue, of course, is going to administer this grant program. So today, I will just say this flat out, is that Valia's got some slides. She's going to walk through the presentation. But today is the opportunity to ask all these questions. I don't care how weird the question may seem. Ask the question today. And if we can't answer it today, we'll make sure that we put our heads together and get you the information that you need in order to make informed decisions going forward under this very important program. So in looking at our agenda for today, we're going to start with just a review of Act 12. Thomas is going to walk us through what that law does. Then we're going to dive into the Innovation Grant Program itself, and that's where Valia is going to shine and give us a lot of her insight as to how DOR is administering the program. And then we're going to follow up with a discussion about how, from a legal perspective, intergovernmental agreements play into Act 12 and the importance of those agreements. And then, of course, we're going to leave time for questions for everybody. As Sarah indicated, if you have a question, please drop it in chat or Q&A. That's a button that's on your screen. We'll get to it as quickly as we can. No need to hold it until the end. I like this to be interactive. I want to know what's interesting or where there are questionable points throughout the presentation. So feel free to use that throughout. So without further ado, Thomas, I'm going to turn it over to you where you get to talk about Act 12 in review.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy. And as Andy alluded, really the star of the show for today is Valia and talking about those innovation grants. But as we set the stage for that, I think it's helpful to look back and to see sort of where we came from as we think about what was the legislature thinking in creating this program and um, how do we analyze that? So Act 12 did a number of things related to local government funding. Those four items that it did are up on that slide. It dealt a lot with sales and use tax authority for Milwaukee County and the city of Milwaukee. It also dealt with personal property tax and creating that personal property tax replacement. Dealt with supplemental shared revenue, and then the crux of our conversation today, creating that innovation grant program. And all of those pieces help answer what I think is a really interesting question. That's a great idea. How are you going to pay for it?
Yeah,
Andy,
and
can you advance?
no, before we advance, Thomas, I just want to interject for 1 second. If you look at the topics that are addressed in Act 12, it's a lot of different topics dealing with different topic areas. And so I know that Thomas, Valia, we've all been involved in seeing the legislation making process, and I've heard it compared to the sausage making process you don't want to see behind the scenes. This is a great example of how we have all sorts of different elements introduced to one piece of legislation. And Valia and her team have the unenviable task of trying to figure out what it is that the legislature wanted done in the context of Act 12. And I think you alluded to that, Thomas, that from our perspective as lawyers in interpreting the provisions, it's important that we go back and take a look at the intent of legislation. Really tough to do here where we've got so many different topics that are just brought into Act 12. So I just wanted to make that point clear. Act 12 was about a lot more than innovation grants. Innovation grants are an important piece, but a lot more than just the innovation grant program.
Yeah, so as I alluded to, one of the pieces that impacts local government statewide is that personal property tax repeal. But fortunately, the replacement of that funding that is applicable to counties, and hopefully you've been receiving those personal property tax replacements. If not, I presume you would have raised your hand by this point.
So let me just say this too, is the reason I think this slide is important is to highlight another piece of legislation that we're working with the Department of Revenue and a lot of other stakeholders on, and that is implementation of the personal property tax repeal to place items of buildings, fixtures, and improvements which are subject to property tax onto the tax rolls. Not as simple as it sounds. So we've been working with assessors, real property listers, registers of deeds, treasurers, corporation counsel, as I mentioned, Department of Revenue. We finally have legislation, and I'm happy to say I think I have a conversation with legislators about that tomorrow, about how we can get that bill introduced to give us some certainty going forward to make sure that, as Thomas said, we get those revenues.
And then another of the programs that had a really significant impact statewide was what I call supplemental shared revenue, adding to the existing shared revenue for those specified purposes set forth in the statute: law enforcement, fire protection, emergency medical services, and things of that sort. Um, this is done as a formula, and again, you should be receiving those monies and spending them for only those specified purposes.
Yeah, and it's implied on this slide, but not stated by implication, it ain't enough. Just want to make that clear. We get that. It ain't enough. And now we get to the big topic, Thomas.
We do. We get to innovation grants and the sort of the focus of today's conversation. We're going to turn it over to Valia in just a second for that overview discussion of innovation grants, what they are, how they're going to work, and then we'll shift back into some considerations and some things to think about as you consider whether the innovation grant is part of the answer to your local government challenges.
All right, so now Valia, you got the spotlight.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And thank you for the compliments. I appreciate that. Okay, so I'm going to take a couple of minutes here and we're going to go through innovation grants. The first slide, and if you want to go to the first slide, just kind of gives a summary of innovation planning grant. So the innovation planning grant was available to smaller communities, and that wrapped up this spring. And we distributed approximately the entire $3 million that was allocated for that program. I think there was like 2,700 left over, but it was allocated to 68 projects, and you can see kind of by service category, the largest was fire protection and then EMS there, followed by public works and then admin and then public safety, which is essentially law enforcement there as well. So we were happy to see that participation as the smaller communities tried to figure out, how to participate in this larger innovation grant program. So you can go to the next slide, and the next one over. So innovation grant, it's $300 million that is available for counties, municipalities, and tribes. Essentially, it created this definition of innovation plan, which is a contract or agreement for a transfer of a service or a duty from a county, municipality, or tribe to another county, municipality, tribe, nonprofit, or private entity. It does have to be an allowable service or duty, and then all of the requirements for the program are outlined in 79038. Now, as we go through these slides and with Innovation Grant, I always kind of evaluate the questions that I get in potential projects with like three pillars. If the county, municipality, or tribe is providing the service pre-transfer, that's kind of requirement number one. Has to be one of those allowable services or duties. So it has to be in the allowable service category or a duty within that category. And then it has to be transferring to an allowable entity, right? Another county, municipality, tribe, nonprofit, or private entity. So I kind of just look for those three things right off the bat before we go into details for potential projects. So you can go to the next slide, Andy. I believe this for the allowable services we had listed here. So you can see it's a broad range of allowable services. We have public safety, fire protection, emergency services. These are highlighted here because by state law, we have to give these three categories priority. So if grant applications come in for these three service categories, we have to essentially give them priority by we're assigning higher points to those grant applications. But one of the requirements is that they have to maintain the level of service that they have right now, and then we can give them priority. But as you can see, I mean, from IT to courts and jails to community.
Did Valia freeze
That
for you?
is not included in this has been mass transportation. Everything else that's been suggested and shared with us so far has been, we've been able to fit into one of these categories. So
one
a
of the
lot of
questions I have,
opportunity here.
one of the questions I have really is, and
Oh,
this
yeah.
comes up because a big segment of county budgets is human services, social services. That's
Mhm.
not on the list. But just because human services is not on the list, I think to your point just made is look at the duties that fall within human services. And my understanding, again, I don't want to put words in your mouth or take a position for DOR, but I think you're looking underneath the title for opportunity to see if those duties would fit within one of these categories. Is that right?
Well, right. So for like human services, would that fall under public health?
Potentially.
Right? Like, and that's kind of what I would be looking for. It's like, the services that you're recommending would it fit under one of these categories? So I think public health is feels pretty broad to me too, when you start looking at some of those human services categories.
Well, and I will say this too, is that I think human services presents multiple opportunities for contracted service, for shift of services or sharing of services between county to county and county to nonprofit. And so if that's going to happen, I would really, really like counties to talk with their corporation counsel about how do we position ourselves in a way that might allow us to take advantage of the innovation grants. And so I think what you're hearing today is, and it's correct, let's take a look at the actual duties and let's figure out how does it fit within one of these categories. We did have a question. Megan asks us, will medical examiner services qualify? And I'll let Valia chime in a moment, but to me, that's a public safety law enforcement question. If we look at medical examiner, the duties of medical examiner under 59.38 and so on of the statutes. Valia, did you have a take on that at all?
Yeah, medical examiner. Well, I guess it depends on the duty specifically, but I would say under public safety or public health in my mind, that would fall
Mhm.
within one of those categories.
And then Trisha asks too, does running a nursing home cover public health? It might, and I think in my estimation, it depends on exactly what services or duties we are transferring out.
Mhm.
If you're just flat out privatizing a nursing home, I don't know that that would qualify. And Valia, feel free to jump in, but there might be opportunity there.
Yeah, I feel like my initial reaction is again, nursing home would be under public health. But you'd want to evaluate again the duties that are being transferred. So I would agree with you there. But I'm targeting that public health category for sure with nursing homes. So
Awesome.
yeah.
And then
Those are
Eric
great
asks,
opportunities and great questions.
oh, it is a great question. I agree. And that's where I think,
Yeah,
again, I want counties to put on their thinking caps. And
right.
it's called an innovation grant. So let's innovate. So I like that. Um, Eric asks us, would a service that is contracted be eligible for an innovation grant if the counties or municipalities decide to consolidate this into a single contract? To put it another way, is the county providing the service directly, not under contract, required? So in other words, Valia, if and to me, it comes down to levy support. If they're levying funds to support the performance of a duty or a service, it doesn't matter how that duty or service is carried out. It's more or less, is that a service or duty that the county is providing, whether by contract or direct employee? Is that right?
You're gonna have to ask that one to me again. I didn't
Yeah.
follow that
It
one.
gets confusing. So let's say
Yeah.
that there is a particular duty that a county is performing, and I'll make it very simple. They hire one person to perform that duty, then they are going to contract out that duty to a nonprofit entity. To me, that's easy. That's okay. We're going from having an employee to we're going to contract out. That is a transfer of service or duty.
Right.
But
The simplest. Yep, go ahead.
what if we have county not providing the duty or service or performing the duty or service through a contract, an employee, but through a contracted entity, an employee, but then they're going to essentially divest themselves of that service or duty and transfer that responsibility out. And I think it would depend on the particulars, but I don't think how the service is performed is as important as is it an obligation that the county is transferring responsibility for to another entity? Is that right?
Yeah, so as long as the county is providing that service pre-transfer, whether it's through contract or them themselves, if they are transferring it to another entity, a separate entity, a different entity, it needs to be a different entity, then that requirement would be met.
Awesome.
Mhm.
All right, now we'll let you get back to the slides, Valia.
All right. So contractor agreement, I just kind of high leveled some of the things that are required by law to be included in that service transfer contractor agreement. So obviously the service or duty that's being transferred needs to be listed. The signature date has to be on or after November 13th of 2024. The effective date, transfer effective date needs to be in there. The length of the contract needs to have a minimum of 3 years. That's a change in the 2025 Act 15. So we didn't really talk about this much, but over the summer, 2025 Wisconsin Act 15 made some significant adjustments to the innovation grant program that we had to accommodate. And they were seen as giving more flexibility, helping, more helpful for local governments, those changes. So everything that you're seeing here accounts for the changes that happened within Act 15 this summer. So minimum of 3 years for that length of contract. And then there's detailed cost information for all the participating local governments that needs to be included. So just a couple of the things you have to include the total cost pre-transfer. So in the calendar year before the transfer, you want to include those costs. You have to include the cost of the first year post-transfer and then the projected or estimated cost for the entire length of the contract. And that's just for the local government participants. The other thing that's included or needs to be included is the allocation of grant funds. So if you all are selected, if your application is selected, we will obviously calculate the total annual payment for the grant, and then you all are telling us how to distribute those payments annually amongst the local government participants. And again, All of this is detailed out in 79038. But within our fact sheet that we have on our website, which is one of the links we'll get to, we have that detailed list of every item that needs to be included in your contractor agreement, in addition to all the normal things that you would put in a service transfer contractor agreement. So this just kind of hits some of the high points. Anything you want to add there, Andy or Tom? No?
We're going to talk a little bit later about the contract itself, and it's going to be a bit of a rehash of some of the concepts we discussed in October. So two things. Number one, we'll get to a little bit more as it relates to those contracts a bit later. So if you have questions, ask then. And I'm encouraging everybody, go to wicounties.org, past event materials, and take a look at our October discussion, which is broadly about intergovernmental agreements, but then we also have some slides on this in particular as well.
The only other thing I would add is there are some special rules if you're transferring volunteer fire services or volunteer emergency medical services with how those costs are calculated. So that becomes a little bit more complicated than putting in a zero as your cost of the service.
Yeah, and that's a good thing to point out. So we have some resources on our website based off of federal information and federal data to give a starting point, right? We have it's a spreadsheet that kind of gives if you had volunteer costs, if you had paid employees, how to compare and maybe allocate cost. You can use the federal data, and there's essentially three options, and we encourage you to take the highest of the three. But it helps you put some cost to those volunteer services that's needed when you are determining your total cost, which is the basis of some of those, the grant payment, et cetera. So you certainly don't want to add a zero there. You want to allocate some cost to those volunteer employees.
Nicole had a question for us real
go
quick,
ahead.
Leah, before we move on. Nicole says,
Mhm.
does the state require that all agreements for the Innovation Grant Program be approved by a vote of the governing board or council prior to the application? In other words, do they have to have a binding agreement in place to apply for the grant funding, or can they just send you what their, I guess, final form proposed agreement looks like?
Well, that's a tricky question. So you might have to help me legally. From our perspective, what we need is a signed agreement by all parties. I would assume that requires getting to the end point of that process. But I am not sure all the steps that happens on the local government side to implement an intergovernmental agreement.
I think that's a great point. So here's my thought on this subject to what Thomas may think as well is two things. Number one, we typically like to see intergovernmental agreements go to county boards. I'll use counties as our example. Go to county boards for approval. Once that approval happens, it does become a binding commitment on the part of the county. But that agreement can also say that it does not become effective until Department of Revenue approves the grant, which is the reason for that agreement in the first place. So if revenue never approves the grant, it's as though the agreement never existed. Does that make sense?
I think that's reasonable too. That makes sense to me.
Thomas, your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think that would satisfy the requirements with respect to submitting a signed agreement to revenue while also having that mechanism to unwind
Yeah.
or to never have wound in the first place.
Very good.
All
All
right.
right, now we can go back.
So 115% cost increase. So something that happened over the summer, the 10% cost savings reduction is no longer a requirement. Now we have the 115% cost increase limitation. So during the grant award period, if your project is selected, when we are distributing the grant payments, we will be looking to ensure that your costs have not exceeded 115%. And so how this works is the total cost for all counties, municipality, or tribes that are participating in this project, their pre-transfer costs, so the calendar year before the transfer, we will calculate, you all will give us, but we'll calculate the total cost. And that's what's going to be used each year. So 115% of that will be X, right? So each year, excluding the first grant payment, we'll do an annual certification process where we'll ask you to certify and confirm that your total cost for that year, essentially for the prior year, has not exceeded 115% of your pre-transfer costs. So it should be a simple certification process we're programming right now. But what happens is if your costs do exceed 115%, the following year's payment, so that payment that would be distributed will be withheld. You can come back into alignment after, in a future year, but we will be asking you to certify, and that's how we'll handle it. If you do pass that certification, we'll distribute the grant payment. If you don't, we'll withhold it, and then we'll do another certification in the following year.
And I think that's a very important thing here is that when Act 12 originally came out, to your point, Valia, it had a 10% cost reduction requirement.
Mhm.
Here we have not only a cost reduction, but there is an allowable actual increase in the costs going forward. Because I think a lot of counties and local governments were concerned, saying, look, it's not as though the overall cost of what we're doing is going down. So just by combining, there's still going to be inflationary pressure. And
Yeah.
so, to the legislature's credit, they addressed that in Act 15 and said, okay, we're going to change the measuring stick, if you will. And to Valia's point, I think that we have a willingness from revenue's perspective to work with local agencies and understand these cost issues. And if you don't hit the mark on this, let's figure out how we can adjust to hit the mark, if that makes sense. Is that fair, Valia?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we would be looking at, so let's just say we're in 2025, right? And we're working to distribute the first grant payment by June of 2026. And so that's why that annual certification, it's not going to, it doesn't apply for that first year. But in 2027, we'll say, we're just talking about a 2026 transfer, right? Did your 2026 cost not exceed 115% of your 2025 pre-transfer costs, right? And so it should be a very simple kind of here was our transferees, total costs, and we'll compare and then move forward. So I think it will be a simple thing. And again, if you do not pass that certification, you can pass in a following year. The other thing that I've heard feedback from is, that 115% stays for the entirety of the grant award period, right? So we had some people say, we don't think we can meet that 115% for the full 5 years or full 6 years of a service transfer. And so they said, we'll probably do a 3-year service transfer contract for the program's purposes for that reason, which is fine. You could do a minimum of 3 years. So that's something else to consider too. How long do you think you can withstand or maintain under that 115% cost increase? So
So
just
Michael
depends on the
asked a good
service, I would assume
question.
too.
Yeah, and Michael asked a good question about what's the penalty if we exceed the 115? What's the look back? What's the clawback? What's the penalty?
Mhm. It is just a loss of that year's grant payment. So a single year's grant payment. And again, you would complete the certification again in the next year. And if you are within the 115%, then you would receive that year. So it's just one single grant payment that you would not receive.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, which is why I wanted to ask it in the way I did. There is no clawback mechanism that
Mhm.
I found or Thomas found in the law. And Valia, you've just confirmed that we don't have a clawback. So I'm thinking about, for example, the ARPA State and Local Government Fund. There is a clawback provision in there for ineligible cost. So we don't have that here. Every year it's an annual certification. Once the certification is made, assuming it hits all of the elements that Valia has discussed in the Innovation Grant Program, you will be awarded that grant money. And then next year you go through the same process. So it's annual measurement, annual certification, annual grant, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's
Nicole,
absolutely correct and very different from ARPA we are seeing. So,
yes, thankfully.
yeah. Yeah.
So Nicole asked a question, how do applicants account for the inflationary increases that are beyond their control? Can we include those increases from the annual certification costs? My short answer is no, but maybe Valia, you can explain when we look at costs associated with the service pre-transfer and post, what is it that you are looking for in terms of detail and explanation for those costs?
Yeah, and we're developing that right now because the first time it'll come up will be 2027. But at a very high level, what we're going to be looking at is your local government total cost post-transfer, right? And so essentially it's going to be what are the transferee, if the transferees are local government, what are their total costs, right? For the person, the entity that has accepted this transferred service and that's performing the service, what are their total costs? We're going to be looking at that. If a local government is paying a nonprofit or a private entity, then that's the cost that we'd be looking at, those contract costs. So when we look at total costs, it really depends. It's only looking at the local governments. We're not going to be measuring nonprofit or private entity costs at all. But we're going to have to figure out if it's the transferee as the local government has taken on that transfer service, or if it's the local government transferor that's paying a nonprofit or a private entity. And essentially, as far as documentation, I can't say definitively right now, but I think it depends on the type of service transfer. So, like I mentioned, let's just give the example, if we have local governments that are transferring to a nonprofit or a private entity, we'd probably looking at, okay, well, what are the invoices, right? What are you paying? What are you paying that nonprofit or private entity under your contract? And we'd have to go with that, right? If it's a transferee, maybe it's a county that local, like smaller communities are transferring a service to a county. And so now the county is the transferee, right? Which would be applicable in this space. What's the county breakdown, right? What's your financial statements for the county to kind of show what are the total costs? She specifically asked about inflation, and there's nothing specifically that gives like an exception in the law for inflation, right? They're putting 115% as, I'm assuming, they're, trying to consider for inflation, right? Trying to consider for cost increases and things like that. Inflation is 100% out of your control. But if it does result in the total cost exceeding 115%, we would have to withhold that grant payment. So that's something to consider. Again, that's where when I've been speaking over the fall, we've been having these conversations about, well, 5 years might be too long. 3 years might seem more reasonable considering the inflation trends. That's why I mentioned that, because you have to consider how long is it reasonable based on the service that you're transferring to maintain or be under 115%. Does that make sense? Am I
It
answering that
make,
question?
yeah, it makes perfect sense. And you highlighted that at the end is the reason I said the short answer is no, is that there is no indexing contained within Act 12 or Act 15. It doesn't exist. So we have to, and the 115, I think, is a recognition of inflationary pressure on the services. So I think no matter what, the expectation is that we have to hit the 115. But you bring up a great point, Valia, which is you really got to think about the term of your contract, because if you don't have confidence going into year 4 or 5 that you're going to achieve the savings, you may want to think about a 3-year contract, or think about a 3-year contract with renewal terms if certain measures show that there's continued cost savings. You can certainly do that too. So Michael gives us a good example, and I'll just put this to you because I think there are 2 different ways that you at Revenue are going to look at this, Valia. Let's imagine that we have a transfer of service for EMS, for ambulance service.
Okay.
Costs $10,000 now, or excuse me, it's going to cost $10,000 upon transfer. It's $12,000 for, I'll just say, the county to run it now. That's a $2,000 savings. Awesome. What if the entity that picked up that service actually spends $15,000 to provide the service? They lost on the contract, all right? But how do you measure that $3,000? And I think the answer might be different if the transfer of service goes to another local government entity versus a private nonprofit. Because with a private nonprofit, Revenue doesn't have the ability to look at those finances and open the books. Whereas with another local government, you're going to get reporting on that particular local government's finances. But do you have a take on that particular hypothetical?
Yeah, so I do, but I want to make sure I'm answering correctly. So can you just give me your hypothetical numbers again? You had 10, 12, and
Sure.
15.
So right now it costs the county 12 grand to run it.
Okay.
They're going to contract with a municipality
Mhm.
and they're going to pay that municipality 10 grand for the same service. But when that municipality actually provides the service, lo and behold, they spent 15 grand. So they lost 5 grand on the contract. So the county's only out 10 grand. Municipality, though, lost 5 grand on that contract, if that makes sense. Their cost exceeded the amount that the county is paying them.
County is paying them. So I think the thing that's not making sense to me in this hypothetical is do you have the county transferring the service to the municipality, Andy?
Yes,
And so when the county is providing the service, it's 10,000. They're going to transfer it to the municipality, and the municipality is going to provide the service, and it costs 15,000.
right,
So that exceeds the 115 in this
right.
example.
And that would be a problem.
Right, right. So
And
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, how would we measure that if the transfer was to a private nonprofit?
Yeah, so it's a little different. So, okay, so let's do that one. So if the county provides a service right now, it costs 10,000. If you're transferring to another local government, yes, we would look at the transferee cost and say, okay, what's that local government paying to perform the service? If it's 15, then it exceeds the 115, right? Um, and it costs too much. If you're transferring to a nonprofit or a private entity, how much is the county paying now to under that new contract? That's going to be what we're looking at. So they
Got it.
paid 10 before. What does that have to be under 11.5? Have to pay no more than
Yeah,
11.5 to a
I think that's
nonprofit
right.
or
Yeah.
private
Yeah, I went to
entity.
law school, so I didn't have to do math. That's why I'm
Yeah.
relying on you for this, Leah.
Well, I got you there. So 11,500, right? So if it's under 11,500 with if they're transferring to a nonprofit or private entity, we're going to, because we're not looking at nonprofit or private entity costs. We're not collecting that information at all. We're only looking at local government participants. We would say as the transferor, how much are you paying? If it's
Right.
under 11.5, then great.
Perfect. Excellent.
Yeah. Okay, so payment distributions. The grant award period ends June 30th, 2030. And so, like I mentioned, we're trying to distribute the first grant payment by June 30th of 2026. So that gives a maximum of 5 years of annual payments. Each year, the grant payment calculation is 25% of the total cost to provide the service for the local government transferors. So each county, municipality, or tribe transferor that's transferring the service, again, will calculate their total cost, and each annual grant payment is 25% of that. So that's how we calculate the amount. The number of annual grant payments, as you can see here, it's based off of the date of the first grant payment and then the duration of your service transfer. So if we get the first payment out by June 30th of 2026 to a recipient, if they have a 3-year transfer, they could get 3 years of payments. If they have a 6-year transfer, they'll get 5. 5-year transfer, they'll get 5. Okay, so minimum of 3, maximum of 5. And then each year, if an entity or local government is participating in multiple projects, we have a limitation that we cannot distribute more than $10 million under this program each year. So we'll be watching out for that if we have an entity, a local government participant that's participating in multiple projects. So one of the things that I feel like it's helpful for my number brain is numbers. So so bear with me, Andy, if you can skip. I have 2 simple scenarios to
All
just
right.
kind of walk through what this really looks like number wise. So in this first scenario, we have a service transfer duration of 6 years, and we're going to distribute that first grant payment by June 30th of 2026. So we're really just kind of maximizing our potential here, right? So what you see here, we can just imagine we're transferring, let's say, IT. So 2 communities. Um, what's displayed are your pre-transfer costs. So community A was paying 80,000 pre-transfer, community B was paying 100,000 to provide this IT service pre-transfer. So when we look at total cost, both of these are local governments. We'll look at what was the total cost before the transfer. That is that 80,000 plus 100, right? So 180,000. That's the total cost that we're going to be using in throughout the calculations. The annual grant payment We'll look at the local government transfers. So on the left side, we have community A, and that's $80,000. So 25% of that is 20,000. Because they have that service transfer of 6 years, they get the max 5 years, which is $100,000 that could be distributed across the length of the award period, right? So essentially, the transfer cost, you could get 125% of your total transfer cost if you have those maximum kind of service transfer duration. And then the last piece is the cost increase limitation. So what's the total cost on both sides? 180,000. Local governments only, right? 180,000. 115% of that is 207,000. So each year when we're doing that certification, we're asking, did your total cost exceed 207,000? So that's the max each year. Before we go to questions, let me show the next scenario. Can you show that next one?
You bet.
This one just kind of shows multiple communities going to one. So same parameters, 6-year transfer, first payment goes out by June 30th of 2026. We have 3 communities transferring a service to one community, right? So total cost, we'll look at all 4, and these are pre-transfer costs that we're displaying hypothetically here. So the total cost of all 4 is 260,000. The annual grant payment, we're only looking at the left side. So the total of those 3 is 160,000 times 25%. So that annual grant payment is $40,000. Multiplied by 5 years, the total they could receive is 200,000. And one point I want to make is when you all are telling us how to distribute that $40,000 annual grant payment, you'll see this here in the form if we get to that. All of the local government entities can receive a portion of that annual grant payment. So A, B, C, or D. However you all want to distribute the grant payment, you all will tell us, right? But transferee, for the local government participants, anybody can be a recipient of that annual grant payment. Just want to make that clear. So $40,000 times 5 years, the total is 200,000. And then that cost increase limitation is just the total 260,000, the pre-transfer cost times 115%. So 299 is essentially what we'll use for annual certification.
And
And
so let me ask
go
this
ahead.
question, Valia, and
Yeah.
because I imagine that County D in this situation will not voluntarily take this on for 40 grand a year. They're going to say, look, I'm taking on a lot of responsibility. I need more than 40 grand a year. So are we saying that the amount remaining allowable for A, B, and C to pay D is $39,000? Is that right?
The amount remaining to pay. No, well, essentially, I think what you'd be doing here is a contract, right? So if
Mhm.
community A, B, and C collectively or individually are spending 100 and what do I say, $60,000 to provide a
Yep.
service, if they're
Yep.
going to contract with the county now to provide that same service, they're going to be paying something,
Right.
right?
Right.
They're going to be paying something. Maybe it would be less than 160,000. Hopefully, right? There's some efficiencies that can be gained
Yep.
by all coming together. So the contract could be less than $160,000, but essentially that $40,000 a year, maximum of 200,000, can be used however you all see fit, right? It can be split amongst the participants, used on projects related to the service, used on the transfer, like initiating and implementing the transfer, or it can be used for separate projects. It can be used however you'd like.
So my question is, and this is what I wanted to make clear, is that when
Mhm.
we're measuring the allowable increase, so to speak, if A is paying D $25,000, C is paying $30,000, and B is paying $50,000, that the payment for that contracted service isn't included in the calculation of the overall cost, so to speak. Is that right?
Right. Like, so each year, as far as the annual certification,
Right.
right, we'll have to, because we don't want to duplicate costs, right? We'll have to
Right.
look at what is County D, what is the county paying to implement the service, right?
Right.
What's the transferee's total cost to implement the service?
Right,
Yeah.
and it's cost, not revenue. So, and I just want to make that clear because I think that was a little bit, in my mind anyways, confusing as to how we reconcile the fact that we are transferring service and we're not asking anybody to take down the responsibility for free, right? that the cost is different than the revenue as it relates to the measurement on the savings.
Yep, absolutely.
So, all right.
All right, so those were the two simple scenarios, and I know we want to leave time for you all to kind of jump into considerations. What I will just say at a very high level, and I'm sure these slides will be shared afterwards. The form right now has been available since September. It's in the My DOR government account, and your county clerk has access to file the form. It's due by March 31st. But what you can see and what you'll be able to see on the slides, which we won't go through right now so that we can go through the rest of the more deeper dive considerations. Each section just is very high level. It goes through, like this one just says, this is the start of the form. You can skip through that. It goes through basics of the agreement. Is it signed? Attach the agreement. What's the service category? If you keep going, Andy. The bottom of section A will just get some dates. As you put in information, the form will populate with information. So if your effective transfer date is in 26, it'll show that the total cost that we're going to be wanting later in the form is for 25, right? So for this one, the transfer date is 25. We're going to want total cost information for 24. And it'll just kind of populate information based off of your expiration date. Here's the maximum potential number of annual grant payments. We ask for the parties of the contract. And then for each party in section C, if you keep going, we'll ask for transferor information that you'll have to put for each transferor that you list. And then if you go one more, section D, there'll be information for each transferee that you list that we'll ask about. And then keep going. Section E summarizes the total cost and asks you to confirm just based off of what you've entered on prior sections. Excuse me. And then go one more. Section F will talk about the 115 cost increase limitation. It'll show you the amount, ask you to certify that you understand and agree with the understanding of the limitation requirement. And then that objective section at the bottom is where we're asking questions about the objectives of the project, and it'll help us in our grant review and scoring. So is your innovation plan improving the quality of the service? Are you incorporating process improvements? Did you use innovation planning grant funds, etc.?
And so let me ask this question, Valia. Is there an opportunity then for narrative on the under objectives? Because I would imagine that there's a story to tell, especially on questions 1 and 2. There's a story to tell there. So I imagine there will be a narrative opportunity for counties, municipalities to provide additional information. Is that right?
Yeah, if you select yes, an open field comes in for you to enter information. So
Okay,
yes, yep.
great.
And an attachment screen comes up if you want to attach additional information.
Okay, great.
Apologies, I'm coughing.
I was going to say, I'm going to keep asking you questions to make it very, very awkward if that's okay.
Totally fine, totally fine.
Good.
Section G is the grant allocation. So we calculate the potential annual grant payment, and then you select if you want to allocate by a dollar amount or percentage, and then you'll kind of see a table for all of the local government participants, how you want to allocate that annual grant payment. And this is just the prepare signature page. So if you go one more to talk about resources, this is the page, our innovation grant page. This URL will bring you, we have everything related to innovation grants, the fair market compensation, the fact sheet, the common questions, everything is housed on this page. So this is the page that you want to pay attention to, and the rest are just additional resources, general DOR resources. So Andy, I'll turn it back over to you because I know we really want to get into some of those additional considerations.
Yeah, thank you, Valia. And like I said, if you have questions, I know that Valia and her team are awesome resources for this. They've put out a wealth of information on their website that really has helped my understanding, and I think everybody's understanding of exactly how this program is going to be administered. So when we talk about the considerations, I know we've talked about these deadlines, but it's really important that we start thinking about this now, because if a county were to submit an application before that March 31 deadline, it maximizes the amount of available funds to that particular applicant, because of course there is a shelf life on the grant payment stream. Valia mentioned this. And so if we wait for a year or two, we are shortening the period of time in which we as a county can qualify for grant funding. So it's important that we start the process now and figure out exactly how it is that we can innovate and maximize the dollar amounts. Now, Thomas and I talked about a couple of questions that we've heard and we think would be important for consideration. And I really want to hear Valia's take on this because I think I understand revenue position, but I want to make sure that we're clear on this. So the question is, can two or more counties or municipalities jointly provide services and meet the requirements of the innovation grant? The short answer is no, that the innovation grant is transfer of services or duties. And so jointly providing the service isn't going to qualify for innovation grant funding. That said, I think there is ability for the counties to jointly create a commission, which is responsible for the provision of those services. And that commission then is eligible for grant funding. Is that right, Felia?
Yes, you can, as long as we've seen at the municipal level, like joint fire, right? Joint EMS. So creating that separate entity that you're transferring the service to, nonprofit, private entity that kind of falls into those categories, that would be acceptable.
Perfect. The third bullet point isn't necessarily a question, but I think it's a reminder when we're drafting these agreements, is that there are other laws and rules and regulations that come into play. What we mean by that is that if we are going to, for example, transfer responsibility for fire or EMS, we know that fire and EMS are subject to certain maintenance of effort requirements contained within Act 12. And so we want to be sure that our contract with the entity, whether you're transferor or transferee, identifies that maintenance of effort requirement and makes provision for the sharing of information necessary to satisfy the MOE requirement. Because the penalties associated with not meeting the MOE requirement, and DOR is going to require certification of that maintenance of effort, the penalty is a reduction in the shared revenue payments that would be coming to your jurisdiction. So make sure that we make provision for that within our agreements. The final question that we've got on this slide is, if we transfer responsibility for a service or duty, could that trigger the transfer of service levy limit adjustment in 59605 sub 3 sub C? And again, I'd be interested in Valia's take, but my answer is maybe if you hit the requirements that are contained within 59605(3)(c) about transferring the service or duty out in a required adjustment to your levy limit as a result of the contract that is going to qualify you for innovation grant funding, there might be a levy limit adjustment. Again, this is one of the considerations and one of the things that you have to consider when it comes to the distribution of those innovation grant funds. If there is going to be a levy limit adjustment and that is going to negatively impact one of the jurisdictions that are party to that agreement, let's speak to this concept of sharing those funds in a way that makes sense for all participants. Thomas, did you have anything on any of these points that you wanted to chat about further?
Not specifically, but I think to address Andy's question about is this a one-time shot to apply or will there be additional rounds? I think the answer there is the statute allows for additional rounds, but the statute also only has that $300 million bucket. So depending on what happens in that first round, I think really determines on is there a second round and what would that distribution look like for second round grants. So the best consideration is going to be in this March 31st, 2026 round, both from a number of payments and a consideration perspective.
Valia, you came off of mute. That means you want to talk about something.
Of course. No, I 100% agree with what Thomas just said. So one of the things that we are anticipating and are preparing for, we will close the application as of March 31st, and we're working to distribute by June 30th. So any applicants that are in by that time can have that maximum of 5 years of payments. If we don't allocate the full 300 million, we will have another round of applications. We'll have another application window. It will be one less year of payments though, right? End result. But we are making sure that we're able to do that if we don't allocate the full 300 million. The other thing that I wanted to point out about the transfer of service levy limit adjustment, just that change, I think it possibly within Act 15. Andy, you might know. I can't recall at this point. The notice of service transfer that's now required to be sent to us in order to implement adjustments to the levy limit. So both parties have to submit that notice of service transfer to DOR for the levy limit adjustments to occur. That's new and recent, so that's obviously something that should be discussed, but is a requirement. So DOR won't be actively reaching out or requesting information about service transfers unless we get that notice of service transfer.
That's a really good point, Valia. And that issue has come up as questions previously, is
Mhm.
that prior to Act 12, DOR theoretically had the right to independently audit and determine if service transfer occurred. At least that was my reading of the law in 660602, I think it was. But now you're right, an actual notice has to be filed by both parties in order to trigger that. So that's a very good point.
Yeah, and it typically was, one party coming to us and asking if this initiated a service transfer, and then we'd have to look into it. But it does make it simpler for administration, and it requires some communication and coordination on the local government side. So,
When we look at the selection criteria, we've covered much of this already, so I don't want to repeat what we've already discussed. But I also want to reiterate something that's been said earlier, and that is there is a priority system. And you heard Valia talk about this, is that when we're talking about cost savings in public safety, fire protection, and EMS, that those will be given priority in the application process. So keep that in mind as you're looking at opportunities to innovate. Again, I think we've talked about this a bit, and I know Valia went through some of the points associated with the selection criteria. The selection criteria speaks to what I think has been a lot of work on the part of DOR to establish the metrics by which these applications are going to be judged. And when I say that, Act 12 and Act 15 weren't perfect in saying, DOR, this is exactly how you need to evaluate the applications. And so I think DOR did a really, really good job on going through the selection criteria and creating objective measurements to the extent possible so that we have some level of certainty about how our application is going to be viewed as a county. So again, if you have questions about the selection criteria and all of that, we put it down here on the instructions in the grant application, but we've gone through it in the previous slides with Valia as well. There's all sorts of information out there about that selection criteria. There is a compliance process to this. Again, we don't have the same ARPA considerations with clawback, but there is reporting and compliance and certification. We've talked about that annual certification process. And so again, there's information on DOR's website about what that looks like. So again, I would encourage everybody to understand and appreciate that from an administration standpoint, we have to administer these contracts, and there are ongoing responsibilities on both sides in administration. It's not enter in the contract, transfer the service, set it and forget it. It's an annual compliance process to make sure that we qualify for the funding associated with the innovation grants. So now we're at the official Q&A part. We've got 3 whole minutes left. Before we get to any other open questions or comments from participants, let me just say to Valia, thank you so much for this. This has been, I think, the most detailed discussion on the program that I know we've been a part of, both of us. And so it's been very, very helpful for me to have this information out here. Really appreciate your help today with all of this. And Thomas, of course, you're great too. I don't want to leave you out. You're great too.
thank you.
But yeah, thank you. I think this has been a very, very good discussion of everything.
Well, I appreciate the time today. I've heard some good ideas, so that's great too.
That is great. I agree.
Mhm.
So now we've got 2-3 minutes for people to ask any questions. We'll leave this open here. And instead of awkward silence, Sarah Diedrich has promised that she would sing her favorite Christmas carol during this time. And so until we have a Q&A, Sarah, question, Sarah, go ahead and start singing if you wouldn't mind.
I would say, Andy, that would probably be the quickest way in which to get questions into the chat in Q&A, because I will tell you, throughout my time growing up, I have been told by my friends that maybe someday I will find my pitch. and then learn how to sing in that area. So no, I am not the person to sing a Christmas carol whatsoever. But what we can do while we wait for additional questions to come on is talk about our January in the boardroom topic, which
And
is,
so it's near and dear to our hearts, Sarah,
I
and
was
I'm
going to
sure
say,
Valee is going to want to sign back on and participate. It's board rules. How fun is that?
that is my favorite topic. I love it. I'm working with a few counties now on their board rules. I know, Andy, you're working with a number of counties as well. It is not too late if you haven't already started to take a look at your board rules prior to your April elections and organizational meetings. So on January 28th, we will be talking about county board rules. Andy, I don't remember. You have a guest coming on, don't you, as well?
Do I? If I do, I can't remember who it is. I'll figure it out
Okay.
eventually.
Okay.
Maybe it's Valia. Maybe she has a keen interest in board rules.
I will certainly listen in.
That could be. That could be.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
yes, we did get, I guess one person was a little concerned I was going to start singing. Thank you, Jeff. Just put in a quick Merry Christmas, everyone, because he wanted to make sure there would be no sound in the
That's
form of a
perfect. Thank you,
song
Jeff.
coming out of my voice.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, happy holidays to everybody. It's been wonderful. And I can't wait to see everybody next year. That's my bad dad joke that I'm going to use from now until December 31. See you next year. So I can't wait to see everybody next year.
All right. So again, we're seeing lots of thank yous and please Sarah don't sings coming through. So if again, just as a reminder to everybody, you will find the copy of this recording along with the PowerPoint slides on our website. Valia, Andy, Thomas, thank you so much. I totally echo what Andy said. I've seen many presentations we have been a part of on the innovation grants. This was by far, I think, the more detailed. I understand it a lot better. So thank you guys for all of that information. We will see everybody back here on January 28th, where we'll talk about board rules. Until then, happy holidays to everyone and have a very happy new year.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.